Well, thank you, Alex, for joining on Kingdom of Dreams podcast. And you're here to speak about Minority Report, your work on that, Saving Private Ryan, and also some preliminary work on BFG. So good to have you.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. It's really nice to be here talking with you.
Wonderful. So just give me a little bit of background on who you are, Alex. Like, how did you get into this world of VFX art direction? And for those of us who don't know what that is in detail and layman terms, if you can explain us that too.
Absolutely. I'm happy to. Well, I come from a background of art. I was raised in a household full of art. My mother was a painter. I was raised in San Francisco, California, and she was a fine artist. And her father was a very successful illustrator and fine artist as well in New York. So you can talk about nature versus nurture, but I think I had some of both because she both encouraged me, and I had that family context of art being acceptable and an accepted thing, encouraged thing, as well as whatever genetic
Yeah.
predisposition I may have inherited. We can debate that another time, but it all added up to being a very supportive upbringing when it came to embracing my creative side. And, and so with that, I pursued, I mean, I was always drawing. I was always making things. I was sculpting. And I fell in love with film, specifically to answer your question, also at a very young age, because my mother encouraged me to experience lots of different kinds of art. She would take me to all sorts of really interesting exhibitions at the museum and films. We went to movies all the time. She loved movies as well. So we went to a lot of types of films, and I fell in love with, not surprisingly, as a young kid, fantasy and science fiction films. And I was captivated by the special effects, by movie magic. And
Right.
at one point, she took me to a wonderful lecture at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art by a veteran effects artist and inventor, Linwood Dunn, who is part of the history. He's an iconic figure in the history of filmmaking from a technical point of view, sort of a
Sure.
behind the scenes point of view. And he really was responsible for the development of the optical printer and all the early analog old school film, pre-digital compositing techniques. He was very instrumental in the advancement of that entire technology of combining pieces of different pieces of film into one, which was employed, in many different ways through all of our 20th century film history in terms of effects. So
Yeah.
he was iconic. He gave this great breakdown of behind the scenes stuff. And not to date myself too much, but this was the 70s. This was before this kind of thing was known, was mainstream, was talked about. And so seeing something like this just blew my mind, and it really started me, I would say, on the track. I'd say that, and then seeing the fantasy films of Ray Harryhausen. So that's nothing shocking. Ray Harryhausen is a much better known iconic
For
figure,
sure.
of course. The grandfather of special effects is what he's often called, among many others. So I fell in love with Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and Seventh Voyager Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts and all of that. And, additionally, I went and saw, my mom, to her credit, took me to see 2001 A Space
Of
Odyssey
course.
on the big screen, of course. So, VHS wasn't even a thing when I first saw it. So that's just how old this guy is. But it's really that's where it all started, to answer your question. I actually took a rather circuitous winding path to get to work in film. It was not the normal course. As I said, was raised in Northern California, far from the schools, the big schools that you heard about,
Right.
UCLA and USC and all of those prestigious film schools. I was a little daunted by those and didn't really feel like I had access to those. We didn't have the money really to sort of afford them. So I
Yeah.
ended up pursuing my visual art and my drawing instead. And that really became the thing that I used to creatively express myself. But meanwhile, my obsessive, nerdy hobby in high school, was making stop motion animated movies in my bedroom with my own little sculptures and monsters and scenes. And I'd make those with a couple of similarly nerdy friends. And that's how we sort of developed our skills. And we would follow whatever media we could at the time, which was limited to a handful of really low budget magazines about animation and special effects.
Yeah.
And so we would get inspiration from anything we could find. And we would go to the sketchiest movie theaters downtown at all hours of the weekend and spend days, the entire day, basically watching triple features of old grainy prints of these B movies just to watch makeup and special effects and animation in any form we could consume it. So we kind of just constantly fed ourselves this diet, and then we go and make our own Super 8 movies. So it was a wonderful way to have a nerdy childhood.
Yeah,
Very
no,
much, different from the norm.
I noticed you mentioned Jason and the Argonauts and Sinbad and Seventh Voyage. Sinbad and Seventh Voyage is probably the first movie that to my knowledge, that I ever saw. And I still remember, the one-eyed, the monster, and then the fight.
Yeah.
And there was another one, Jack and the Giant Killer. I don't know if you've seen that one.
Of course. Oh, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned it.
And the stuff, I mean, if you look at it now, I mean, yeah, it looks, especially Jason and the Argonauts, like the skeletons fighting, the sword fighting.
Yeah.
It looks so good, even if you consider that it was in the 60s and, pre-Star Wars, pre-2001 Space Odyssey era.
Oh, yeah.
And great movies.
Amazing. I know. And it was really, at that point, it was almost entirely one man. It was Ray, Harryhausen, and he had assistants. We don't hear a lot about them, but he had some, but largely really was shouldered by him. He really kind of pioneered the whole thing. He was standing, of course, on the shoulders of other giants. Before him, Willis O'Brien, known for King Kong and Mighty Joe Young, really did develop cinematic stop motion animation, at least in LA. There's many other Eastern Europe, a handful of other artists who get a little less notoriety for inventing a lot of, being very inventive with visual effects as well in Eastern Europe. And the name is escaping me now, but there are a couple of wonderful animators and filmmakers from back then who also invented quite a few techniques. But Willis O'Brien is the one that is known for bringing them all together, and then Harryhausen trained under him. And so that's a heck of a first movie experience to have for you.
I think it was the first. I mean, if my memory serves me right, yeah. I mean, that, Jaws, Raiders. I don't think I ever saw Star Wars until in the 90s. I never got exposed to Star Wars. But
wow.
Yeah. But you mentioned stop motion. I'm interested to know, Aardman animation is, like, to me, the king of storytelling and stop motion combined, right? Like, you look at Wallace and Gromit, Chicken Run. Now they're working on I think there's a Chicken Run 2 coming out next year.
Good.
How was there ever sort of an inspiration to be working there, or how did you end up at ILM? Were you at ILM? Sorry, I just have to make sure that.
Yes, I was at ILM. Yeah, and Aardman didn't exist back then. It was pre-Aardman.
Mid-90s. Aardman.
I don't know. They may have mid to late 90s. I sort of equate them with being a little later, but I don't know the exact date. But when I was interested in stop motion, it was way before Aardman had sort of the exposure to stop motion animation beyond special effects and visual effects movies like Harryhausen's was also these traveling anthologies of animation, these tournée, the International Tournée of Animation. And I believe this was out of Canada. I believe it was Toronto had a big animation. Quebec had a big animation, huge animation, huge relatively speaking, indie animation scene, and film bureaus and committees that appreciated animation, and they would assemble these international tournees that would then tour. There were 2 hours worth of 24 animated shorts, and these tended to be very artistic and sort of elevated artistic animation, sometimes very personal, very dark, lots of different styles, and some lighthearted, but very much artistic, not mainstream Disney or typical cartoon animation. And they would tour, and they would come to the Museum of Modern Art, and that's another thing that my mom always took me to, was these animation compilations. And that went on for a while in different forms. Spike and Mike was another variation of that, which was a lot more subversive and kind of snarky and R-rated later on.
Yeah.
That would travel around also. And so those were other ways that animation in all these different styles, including some really sort of edgy, inventive, original styles,
Sure.
started to kind of get exposed. So that was another source of inspiration for a lot of us. But to answer your question, I found my way to ILM in a very indirect way. I studied illustration and fine art and graphic design and art history, kind of a hodgepodge. Got my degree from a small, really wonderful art school in Oakland, now in San Francisco as well, called California College of the Arts. Then it was called California College of Arts and Crafts, but they had a great illustration and fine art program. I kind of mashed them together in my own way, but I wasn't studying film. I again ended up pursuing illustration and graphic design as my first attempted career. I was hired by a company in Half Moon Bay, a very small startup in the early 90s that was starting to do computer graphics. And this was just when the Macintosh was being released and desktop computers were a thing. And suddenly people were starting to experiment with bringing animation techniques to the computer, and those were becoming democratized and able to be produced outside of some huge computer lab or a university research department where these giant computers had been. And so now this was suddenly put in the hands, these tools, the early crude versions of them, pre-Photoshop or early Photoshop, for instance, were put in the hands of a lot of different people. So this was pretty revolutionary, obviously very disruptive and a historic shift happened at that moment. So I was hired by this company on the basis of my cartooning and illustration skills that were starting to put together this kind of product for corporate uses. So they would scan my drawings in and create animation on the Macintosh that would then be digitized. And they trained me from the ground up. So I got hired by them, and it was one of those lucky breaks because my first job here, I was being trained in these brand new tools. So I learned early Photoshop, Illustrator, 3D modeling tools, 3D animation, video editing, super crude by today's standards, but these were all the early versions. And that's what got me into it. That's kind of what started to turn the lights on in my head and it exposed me to digital tools. And I went in very skeptically, by the way. I was very snooty about old school techniques that I'd been trained in, physical, tactile media. And so this digital thing was very much like, not sure about this. Didn't take long for me to be seduced by it. This was called multimedia back in the early 90s. Yeah, multimedia was it. Remember all that? And so CD-ROMs is how you distribute these things.
Everything.
You're starting to see these PCs and Macintosh computers in more people's living rooms. And education was one of the ways that these were, being used early on, being experimented with. Maybe we can use this for some interactive kids education experiences, games, basically education games, point and click kinds of things. So that's what I ended up getting into. For the next 5 years, I joined another multimedia company, a small one up in Marin County, California, across from San Francisco. And we did museum exhibits, educational museum exhibits using animation of various kinds and interactive screens that you'd click on. And we worked on a children's ABC educational cartoon game, which and a bunch of corporate stuff as well for training. All of this was starting to embrace digital, and it was also teaching me how to be an art director. And I learned my creative management and creative direction skills there as well. So this was a critical maturing opportunity for me in my early 30s. And then that, by a happy circumstance, one of these happy accidents of being in the right place at the right time, and then showing initiative at that moment when I needed to, all the pieces came together and I got interviewed at ILM. And I had been again in San Francisco Bay Area, knowing that Industrial Light and Magic was right there in this industrial area of San Rafael in Marin, driving by it on the freeway, knowing it was there and feeling like it was, this walled off golden city, which is ironic because it was an industrial collection of very anonymous and humble buildings, anything
Yeah.
but shiny and golden, but that didn't matter to me. So the opportunity to interview at a place like this, to get inside there, to go beyond the walls of what I knew what was going on then. This was 1996. Was an amazing thing. It was an amazing thing. Yeah. So I got hired. I got hired into their art department, and finally to get around to answering your question about what my job was and what I did all those years as a visual effects art director.
Sure.
The art department at Industrial Light and Magic was and still is, for the most part. Everything's changed at ILM, of course, but it's in some ways similar. The art department is centralized. The art department is a central kind of service group, a service bureau, if you will, to all of the rest of the productions throughout ILM. And so a production is a visual effects project, a film that comes through ILM, and there can be half a dozen or more at any given time. Now the company is scaled up, of course, so much that I think the number is much higher. But the way it was then, you have an effects supervisor, and you had a CG supervisor, and an animation supervisor. And in the older days, you had an art director who were part of the senior creative and technical leadership, all reporting up to the effects supervisor. And the producer, cannot forget the critical VFX producer role as well, who's right up there as the partner to the effects soup. And those two really form the tip of our pyramid and the conduit with the studio and the director and the production. So visual effects is considered post-production. We're the thing that starts once production has wrapped and the film is in the can, and that's when we begin. That's the old model. Now there's a lot more overlap because digital production techniques are so interwoven with production that same thing still has to happen. But let's just say the integration of digital and visual effects happened so much earlier in the design process, in the production scheduling and planning, and what's going to be on a soundstage and what's going to be on location, and which of those locations can be done digitally later. All of these decisions have, of course, changed radically since those days, but the basic building blocks of techniques and production practices we have now, they were laid down back then in the late 90s and early 2000s when I was there. So that is to say that this was an explosive period for visual effects when I joined, because digital was coming, it was early days. These toys, so to speak, these techniques were being played with a lot of enthusiasm by directors and studios. To date, that period in terms of movies that were in ILM studio then, Men in Black was just
Terminator
being made.
2, Jurassic Park.
Terminator 2 had already happened, and Jurassic Park had already
after,
happened.
yeah.
Exactly. They'd already happened. The Mask had happened. So digital was already being used. Some of the big breakthrough experiences, The Abyss, for example, those had already happened, and we were now in the wave that was following that period.
Sure.
So it was a really exciting time because you had old school and new school really working together. We had a wonderful model shop that we're very well known for, amazing miniatures and incredible artists and craftsmen there. Of course, we had all our stages and our motion control cameras, and there was a lot of physical filmmaking that was part of our process. And in addition to, of course, all the compositing. And I really enjoyed this combination of old school and new school. I'm kind of a sentimental fan and extra interested in VFX history, with the early childhood experiences I described earlier. It's not surprising that I love sort of the old school techniques and how clever they are, the in-camera effects techniques. And so I love seeing miniatures used with digital compositing. I felt like we were entering into a period where we could get the best of both. And that's still really the case in some areas.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that because I find once a technology comes out, it's overly used in some cases. In some cases, it's
Yeah.
combined with the actual physical sets or miniatures, like you said. I think so. There are very few directors who use combination of both very well. Christopher Nolan is one of them.
Sure.
Obviously Steven Spielberg, James
Peter
Cameron,
Jackson, Cameron, Peter Jackson. Yeah.
Peter
Yeah.
Jackson, and it's I personally, and I think I agree with you about the old school thing is I I can you're not in the space with the characters when they're in a green screen room, period. Like that's it
Right.
for me. Like you can tell. I mean, maybe I'm in the film business. Maybe that's why I maybe pick things. But you're not there. But when you're actually physically on a set, and then it's
Hmm.
combined with, like, for example, what was that movie, Interstellar?
Yeah.
um when they go on the planet and the spaceship lands in the water, that was all
Hmm.
real. Like, it was actually a real ship that they built. But obviously there was, I mean, the multi layers of effects after that. So I think that now that 90s era is coming back, because I do feel, with some exceptions from 2000 onwards up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it was just heavy effects, digital.
Digital. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm glad now it's coming back, because you lose the characters, you lose the story, right?
Yeah, there's a hard to pin down quality of the physical, of light hitting a real object and light hitting a character, whether it's a puppet or someone in makeup or whatever.
Yeah.
That's missing, and the immediacy of it. There's still a lot of innovation happening that is attempting to bring that sense of immediacy in the digital, using digital tools, kind of mixing things. And I'm really excited about stagecraft and the volume and basically immersive LED wall spaces, as you were seeing in the used in the Mandalorian. Still with ILM's
Yep.
participation heavily, obviously driving that. They're not the only ones in the industry doing LED walls, but they've certainly gotten the most notoriety, and they've been ahead of the curve, partnering with Epic, who makes a real-time game engine called Unreal. So Epic is also an amazing company making these amazing real-time tools that allow artists to build these digital environments super realistically and rendering them in real time. So video games and film, and I went into video games later in my career and kind of went back and forth. There was a lot of talk back when I first made the crossover in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, that there was this convergence happening there. The buzzword was convergence, and it was kind of an aspiration that video game and film makers and video game makers could come together, and the mediums were going to kind of merge somehow. And it was a lovely thought in a way, but it was also missing the point, and it never really happened the way people thought it might. They didn't really know what it meant. Are we going to have films that we can interact with but watch in a movie theater, or are we going to have games that look more like film? And that's actually the latter one is what we've seen happen much more. But they're still very different. And so with these volumes, there's ways of bringing background environments into the set so that the actors can react, and the lighting and the mood and the vibe of even a digital environment can still surround the actor, giving them that grounding that you were just talking about. We're starting to see that still with this merging of game and filmmaking techniques. That's what I'm calling real convergence finally happening, because it's not in the medium itself. We're still the output
Yeah.
is still a linear piece of entertainment, but they're using techniques and cross-pollinating different approaches in a way that's quite deep, and it's revolutionizing the way scenes are filmed, and the way locations are scouted, and the way film budgets are are allocated right now. It's upending a lot and offering a huge number of options. It's very exciting.
Well, they're doing that now on Netflix, I think, right? I mean, it's not really a combination of game, but it's more like an interactive film where you choose an obstacle. If you choose this step, you'll face that obstacle.
Right.
And
Choose your own adventure
yeah,
model, interactive narrative. Yeah,
yeah,
I was at HBO for a brief time with a trying to start up a group there, working with a group trying to explore the future of just that interactive narrative. What would it be like to watch Game of Thrones and be able to choose, not just choose binary paths, decision points, like in the Black Mirror episode that you might be referring to, that got a lot of notoriety. Um, I don't remember the name of it, the episode. It was excellent though. I enjoyed it. It was an interesting experiment,
yes.
a very interesting experiment. It's really, really hard to do that, really to pull it off, but it's an area that fascinates me for sure.
Do
So
you
I,
think?
I think we're going to see a lot more artistic boundary pushing experimentation with interactive narrative for sure.
I wonder, and this is probably too far-fetched, but then again, where we are right now, 60 years ago, nobody would have imagined. I wonder with the evolution of AI and this new, well, it's not really new, but it's becoming more popular, the meta world and everything.
Metaverse, yeah.
Yeah, metaverse. And I wonder if there is a way, when you're making a film, let's say Games of Thrones, you're filming an episode and you're trying to make it interactive. So you have to do different, if this happens, this is what I'm gonna go. You have to shoot all these different scenes. I wonder if with AI, the evolution of AI, if it becomes so powerful where you don't necessarily have to shoot all these extra scenes, AI automatically does it for you. Like it digitally creates certain environments for you. I wonder if that's something that's possible.
I think it is possible. It's a little scary,
It
but it
is.
seems like
It
a
is.
logical, scary from a number of different points of view. But from the defensive point of view of an artist, a practicing artist in the industry who doesn't want to have their job
No,
taken
yeah,
away, that's a whole other discussion. But AI is showing that it can do a lot. It can't do absolutely everything, but it can do a lot. What you're describing is a whole level up in terms of
yeah,
sophistication, but to say that it's not possible would be naive. Whether it would be good or not is a whole other question. But we're talking about also steps on the way to such a future.
yeah,
So perhaps AI could be useful for a portion of the production, like the background. Say you make a decision in your branching story point that's going to affect the environment. And it's the same environment, but in one version, it's blazing hot. It's sort of a blazing hot hellscape. And in another version, it's an Arctic snow covered tundra,
sure,
right? And so it's the same environment, but dressed differently. Or
yeah,
maybe it's an apocalyptic future as opposed to a splendid, wonderful, verdant green future. So just whatever contrast you want in the story. AI tools, a lot closer to what we have now, could absolutely be used. I can see a pretty clear path where AI tools could be used to generate those backgrounds because there's a certain contained, you're drawing a certain line between what the variability is.
sure,
Having the AI literally control, choreograph, and script the character or characters and their behavior at a high quality level is an entire other level of complexity that seems a whole jump ahead. But
yeah.
hey, could
Well,
happen.
it gives me a nice segue to your work on Minority Report, which we'll come to. But Minority Report was written, I think, in the 60s or the 50s, and
Yeah,
the film came out in the early 2000s, and this whole thing about retina scans and all this
yeah,
other stuff that was in the film, it's hair, right? Like all this
yeah.
stuff, facial recognition system and all that. And that takes me to the next point is how did you get involved? And we'll come to Saving Private Ryan, but since we're talking about technology, how did you
Yeah.
get involved in Minority Report? At what stage, and what was your work for it? Like what scenes did you work on?
Oh, I absolutely. I will. It's a good way for me to sort of connect back to the story I was telling earlier about how ILM's art department works and
Sure.
how ILM serves as a sort of post-production step that still gets involved early on with the production when they're filming. And so this is a great example of how that handoff and how that collaboration works and how there's sort of a shared vision, even though it's separated by time. there has to be a continuity of style between the production's work, obviously filming, and everything that's added later. It all has to feel the same. And so with Minority Report, ILM had a long and fruitful relationship with Steven Spielberg, obviously for many years and many productions, and a lot of innovation as well. I have to say, in the context of a lot of these other films and a lot of the films that have come since, Minority Report was a fairly modest and contained effects movie. It did not have a huge budget for a DreamWorks level film. It was modest. I mean, it had Tom Cruise and it had this amazing cast. So it's not to say that it was overly humble, but from a VFX point of view, it was not meant to be extravagant. Spielberg's philosophy about the way the effects should feel in the film was very specific and made really clear to us. And it was his philosophy for the design of the whole movie. And that is that it feel grounded and realistic and not overly shiny or sexy or futuristic. That the ways that it felt futuristic needed to be very realistic. They needed to, they weren't about shiny chrome surfaces everywhere and flying cars and whatnot. We had Maglev cars, which was the compromise, but he wanted everything in there from a technology point of view, as well as from a sociological and cultural point of view, from an architectural point of view. All of the aspects of the world building, he wanted to be grounded in research and as much tangible, known reality as possible. And so to do that, he gathered, as many people know, he gathered this research think tank, this group of consultants to all come together and have this big round table when the script was still being finished. And this is, again, all before ILM is really in the mix at all. The person who's the closest to my job, who's in the mix there, is the production designer. The production designer is responsible on any film, on the production side, for designing the look of the entire movie. And really, and working closely with the director from the very beginning, and then working with the director of photography throughout all of production, and all of the other art directors who work on the sets, the scenic, the dressers, the prop people, the lighting team, all of this team of crafts and artists who work together are following the high-level direction of the production designer. I had someone, a veteran production designer on a film I worked on, tell me that one way to think of the job of a production designer is that they design the production. And that's a very cute, glib way of saying it. This was Grant Major, who designed Lord of the Rings films, by the way. So, a formidable person. And he said this with certain tongue in cheek, but his point was that it's not about designing every beautiful thing visually. It's about the logistical planning exercise, the problem solving, the strategic planning of the whole production. How do you get from script to final filmed result in X amount of time with this budget and these resources and all of the logistical puzzle pieces that have to be fit together that lead you to decisions, practical decisions about what sets you're going to be able to build, how big those sets can be, how many can we build at once so we can film this many scenes over 2 weeks. If we're going to be on location here and we only have 3 days, how can we make that work? And that always leads then to, those limitations lead to the need for visual effects. And that's why the production designer and their team lead to and connect with the work that someone like ILM is going to do. So back to Minority Report. Alex McDowell is the name of the production designer who worked with Spielberg on Minority Report. And he is an awesome production designer with an amazing resume. I've been fortunate enough to have the chance to work with him a little bit since then and get to know him a little bit. And he's just a terrifically smart guy. I highly encourage you to invite him to speak about his career, including Minority Report. But he also designed Fight Club. He designed
Chocolate Factory,
Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and many others. He's just got a visual, and for DreamWorks, he also, I believe, was participating in B Movie. We had talked a bit about B Movie before. So he was He was working in various scales and capacities with DreamWorks for a while. And I got to know him just peripherally on Minority Report. That's where we met. And really, this is the example of that handoff. You know, we went down to meet with him. Again, we're in Northern California. George Lucas, when he set up ILM, he wanted this distance from Hollywood. He wanted this feeling of independence. Later, many years later, of course, we had to close that gap logistically. How do we communicate smoothly with the production when we're many miles away? Well, we had early video. We had early video conference, early versions of Zoom. Nothing like Zoom, but it was much more cumbersome, much more clunky. But, you know, we made it work. And we were able to talk to each other like this. And we were able to, more importantly than seeing each other, we could see the film. We could see the film frames we were working on. We could run the shot, scrub back and forth, and we could have a frame by frame review of every shot that we were working on with the production in real time. And we would do this every morning. Luckily, we were in the same time zone, so it made it a little easier, at least for that film. But I'm getting ahead. How I got to be involved in this is I was working in the art department, and it came in as one of the jobs we were going to do. So I was assigned to be the art director on this film. And this was compared to something like The Mummy, where the director had come to us early on and had us involved with the design process of the creatures and the characters and the environments very early on, helping us really design the look of the movie along with the production designer. In this case, a lot of work had been done prior to it ever coming to us. So this was a different version of that process. And there's all varieties of this. Just with every film is different. You know, different productions, depending on how visual effects heavy they are, they will have done a lot of their own design work up front with their own art departments down at the studio. And by the time we at ILM would get that work, they had thought through, in those cases, a lot of the visual decisions and a lot of the broad style of the movie. And this was the case with Minority Report. So they had this amazing think tank where they brought in all of these experts from many different, industries, and to consult about what life would be like in Washington, D.C. 50 to 75 years in the future from then. It was not a far future. Again, it was a near future. And he brought in all these technologists as well in that mix. And so Alex McDowell and his art direction team and production design team, including some concept illustrators and visual designers, were all in that mix, I believe. I would have loved to have been at that table, but this was, again, prior to our involvement directly. But that is what really fed into the world building, the design of the world that they landed on, and that is what influenced the building of the amazing sets and the design language of the architecture and the feeling of the clothing and the fashion. All of this is, again, that production team. When we got the assignment, we had several meetings. We got this packet of amazing artwork, and then my job, working with Scott Farrar, the effects supervisor, and Dana Friedman, our effects producer, and our whole CG team. But early on, it was just sort of the senior folks. Really, my job was to translate the aesthetic and the future design language of the world that Alex McDowell and all of the visual people working under him and around him had developed, to take that and translate it into the visual effects extensions that we would be providing, showing the larger world. And we worked on a number of different sequences, which were big and showed the wider view of the world, and others that were much smaller and more intimate, like the plants, the sort of moving intelligent plants that are in the greenhouse at the end of the film, and a lot of other miscellaneous effects throughout the movie. And I'm happy to talk, if you'd like, about some of those in detail. I happen to have some of the artwork here as well. If that's of interest, I can go into a few examples.
Absolutely.
All right, wonderful. Well, I'll start by showing an example of some of the artwork we got from the studio. So this is an example of a concept piece, a keyframe, showing what we later
Yep.
nicknamed the Waterfall building. This building with, here you see
Ours.
Tom Cruise on the Maglev car, about to plunge over this vertical stretch in this amazing action scene. So this was created by an artist, Gerner, and there were designers who worked on the design of the cars, and there were concept artists and industrial designers who worked on the look of the buildings. So we got this basic sort of seed, very clear, more than a seed, quite a sophisticated development. And we had a set number of shots, and we had a set number, we had a budget, and we couldn't go absolutely hog wild. We had to work within some constraints. So again, my job was to kind of take the next step to making that vision real. And tangible is probably a better idea. Realistic looking and tangible, but we had to find a way to build it and make the scene actually work. And so that's where the problem solving, sort of cinematic problem solving, came in. There's another part of the process besides drawings and storyboards, and that's animatics. Pre-visualization is the broad word we use for this. And for those that don't know it, think of a storyboard, a sequence of drawings that describe each shot, and then think of animating those. So now you can show a moving camera shot. You can show some of the action.
Yeah, they did that with for Jurassic Park. I remember in the behind the scenes stuff they did, like before the digital dinosaurs were discovered, they did
right.
all those sequences for Spielberg. But go on, sorry.
No, that's a great example, because that's taking pre-visualization and animatics to a whole other level. They were using stop motion animation to do some of those. So they started off with drawings, and then they actually built miniatures. Phil Tippett was the stop motion animator, still is, the stop motion animation veteran genius who runs Tippett Studios. And he had been working on the pre-digital experiments for how to do the dinosaurs using stop motion when they decided to make the jump back then to digital dinosaurs, which was a huge decision. They kept Phil Tippett on to take advantage of his mastery of the medium and his understanding of performance and behavior and anatomy and animation at its core. And so he did the entire sequence you're talking about, many of them, using stop motion as a motion and performance template, a base sort of inspiration for the digital animators to come. So it's a really wonderful example. I'm so glad you brought that up. So previs, however, we don't use stop motion animation now mostly for that. It's very time consuming. So we use digital, very simple rudimentary digital 3D animation, but also 2D, where we will literally take storyboards, cut them up into pieces, and animate them so that we can see a sense of timing in the sequence. So we received a combination of different kinds of animatics and previs, as we call it, from the production. So the sequences and the shots had been fairly well defined. But again, it was a far cry from figuring out exactly what our shots really could be. So I existed as sort of a translator and a bridge. So among the things, this is an example of the sort of thought exercise that I would go through visually. This is just one of 3 or 4 different studies I did to figure out just how tall a building could realistically be in terms of plausibility, in order for, and this is just basic napkin math, if we're having the building fly by during this whole Maglev action scene where Tom Cruise is jumping from car to car as he goes down this, how many seconds do we have in film time for the sequence to get from the top before he'd hit the bottom? And he needs to sort of jump off at a midway point in the sequence. So this is where film is not reality. Of course, it's all nothing but cheating and storytelling and magic and hand waving. So the actual height of this building is complete fictitious. It's completely made up. Our job is to just not make the audience think about it, but to convey, by showing things flying by in the background, to suggest the speed, to give them the sense of vertigo and danger, and to make it feel like over the course of the sequence, we're kind of getting closer, lowering down a little, but the ground is still always far, far below us. So this simple test and this piece of artwork here done by Aaron McBride in our art department. He was my one of my illustration partners in this to help visualize a lot of these drawings. How high up, what will it look like from the top of the Waterfall building with our complex sort of on-ramps? You know, this is a much more realistic height. But at what point does being 150 stories up in the air with this kind of freeway structure feel fake? My job was to keep everything feeling very realistic and grounded again, right? And it could never start feeling like some Dr. Seuss-like architecture that just defied all physics and gravity. And this was a great way to visualize early on when that started to break. So when the illusion would break. So this is jumping now to sort of the architectural design part. This was based on a sketch that I had done. This is a 3D model and concept rendering of this building at the top. Spielberg wanted to have some futuristic advertising and billboards, animated billboards, as part of the future as well. So we designed these big spaces to sort of fly by us at the very top of this building. And then this is a final frame, near final frame, showing what the final building. And again, this illustrates the aesthetic. This is not some shiny, wonderful fantasy building. It's a really brutalist, kind of ugly, boring cement building that is intentionally designed that way to be mundane, but just a little bit, off from what we're used to, a little bit different from what we're used to. And that's by virtue of it being so tall.
I find movies like Blade Runner. I don't know if you've seen Looper.
Years ago, yes, loved. I like
Looper, Minority Report. Even Back to the Future, the second one. A lot of this, they're considered sci-fi, all of them in a way, futuristic sci-fi, and a lot of them all four of the titles that I mentioned, they use special effects very, very effectively, where they were not overly done. So, like, one thing I loved about Minority Report is, those alleyway sequences, even the one that you just showed, it was very minimal. It came, you got the point, and it moved. It wasn't like overly done just to wow the audience, right? And that's what I loved about it. And it just blended in. It just blended in.
And the words you're saying are exactly what Spielberg would hope, because that's what I learned. We're a visual effects studio, then. And so naturally we're invested in the spectacle, right? Yeah. And there was a part of me coming in that was looking forward to more shots, more big shots showing the world and the vertigo and, more epic scale. And there was enough there, but Spielberg's sensibility kept pushing back. And that was also a budget thing. He wanted that minimalism that you're talking about. He wanted us to have a sobriety, as you said, just enough to convey the action. But he was really inspired by, I think, an earlier style of suspenseful action filmmaking that films like Hitchcock's North by Northwest is a great example of just this economy of shots. And there isn't a dwelling on something beyond. It's all about the choreography that the scene demands. And it is not about showcasing visual effects in a gratuitous way just for the sake of spectacle. And Spielberg's known as the king of spectacle, but really that so undersells what his wisdom is creatively. He's a storyteller and he understands this balance. And less is more sometimes. Even though frustrated us sometimes, but he kept that contained. And I learned from it.
For sure, because that scene, I remember it was about when Tom Cruise's character, was it Anderson? I think
Anderton, with a T.
He gets these passengers out and he calls his boss and he's like, "I'm being set up," right? And there was so much tension in that scene that for that when the scene is being shot from inside the car, you forget about future, you forget about technology, you forget about special effects, because that's where the focus is, the story and the character and where it's taking us.
Perfect. So that's another great example. You happened. It's as if we coordinated this conversation in advance, Jawad, because that's another example where I was very involved with designing what was going to go by outside the window during that very intense sequence. The camera is low. right underneath his lap, pointed up at him, and we see the curved window of the car he's in, and we see freeway stuff going by. So as an art director, as any production designer as well, I'm always looking for opportunities, even incidental ones,
Sure.
to describe the world outside, even if it's literally something going by a window. It's incidental. It doesn't matter compared to the dramatic focus, of course, but it's still an opportunity that we use. We're always focused on every frame, every pixel, every bit of the frame. And that's a canvas we can use, however subtly, to telegraph something about the world. So, hey, we're pointing the camera up. We see this freeways going by. How are we going to do those? Maybe it's another great opportunity to showcase some of this Maglev stuff. But actually, the way it turned out, we focused way down on it. You know what we ended up doing? We ended up going out in a car, in a convertible, with a camera, Scott Farrar and the rest of our team at ILM, and scouted around the San Francisco Bay Area. And we ended up shooting real freeway overpasses and just compositing them in, matching the angles, and just compositing them in and darkening them down. Those are all real freeways there. They're not futuristic visual effects freeway overpasses because they didn't need to be. Yeah. So we went super simple for exactly the same reasons you just pointed out. And again, budget. It was the fastest way to get the effect. And it was not appropriate for us to use that little glimpse as some, hey, look at me, I'm a cool futuristic piece of architecture. Yeah. Not appropriate. So to go back to
sorry,
futuristic architecture. No, that was a fantastic point you brought up. So there's this scene with the tunnel, and I don't have a finished frame of it, but a shot where we're going through this incredible sort of tunnel structure of this Maglev freeway. And it's just one shot. It's one or a couple of quick shots. And yet we had to build this entire fantastic looking structure. So the high level vision for what this thing would look like was in one of those concept paintings we got from the studio. But again, this was a challenge now to figure out how to make it so we could build it. And so I used a rather old school technique of my own, which was just building a foam core and paper model with designing where these on-ramps could be and how traffic would flow from one down into the other as our camera would follow it. And by building this simple model, because it was faster for me to use physical techniques than digital ones at the time, that had to do with my skills as a 3D digital artist. It was easier for me to just do this first as a bridge from the 2D drawings, the sketches, to what would be the 3D model in the computer. And this allowed us to just get together, for me and Scott, Farrar and others, to have the conversation about where the cars could flow, where the camera could track them. And it was just very immediate and tangible. And so it was really fun. I like to tell this story because, again, this was a period where you could have old school, tangible, physical design tools combining with the digital process. And it proved to be really fruitful. A very quick, simple beat in a long design process, but it has almost historical sentimental value to me now.
Tangible stuff is always great. I don't think that will ever go away. It will still have its value, right? Because just like I was saying before, like Christopher Nolan, Spielberg, James Cameron and such, like they will use these physical objects. I mean, I didn't even know in Inception. I learned this like 2 years ago during COVID when I was watching the behind the scenes stuff of Inception, that whole sequence of them in this hallway and when they're flying upside down, it was all like an actual hydraulic stage, which they built.
Yes.
And because it was so real, you never look it up. Okay, how did they do it? Because it was just so real. But then looking at it, holy crap, they actually did that. They actually built a physical hydraulic.
I mentioned 2001: A Space Odyssey earlier as one of the earliest inspirations for me, and of course, legions of other filmmakers and people and sci-fi fans. And in so many ways, that film was an inspiration, among many others, of course, but that's one of the ones that I connect with Christopher Nolan's use of that kind of technique of rotating stages and spending the money on that physical, mechanical setup is so ambitious in its own right, and yet the result is that you get that physicality. And when you go back to look at 2001, and I'm not talking about the outer space stuff with the spaceships and miniatures and all the techniques they used, 2D and multiplane animation and all of that, but just the physical set building and the way they had those characters, the astronauts and the stewardesses and the pilots walking around these, walking on the ceiling and walking around the staircases, the circular spherical stuff, ignoring gravity. Those were so convincing and so simply done in that respect. Same kind of technique, big revolving stages when he's running around the giant centrifuge and goes for his jog, and the camera is following him in this continuous shot. This is famous stuff, but you can see the line between that and Christopher Nolan's use of that in the fight scene you talked about. It's all the connection is right there.
Well, most definitely. I think a lot of people were inspired by 2001, Spielberg, George Lucas.
Absolutely.
Make all
the whole generation. A whole generation of filmmakers. Yeah, absolutely.
I remember when I first saw it, this was early 90s. I'm like, what was that? Like it just didn't hit, like, the story wise, it didn't make sense to me. But then I saw it again 10 years later. I was like, yeah, this is like a masterpiece even in today's time, right? Because not just from a storytelling, but just the way it was done.
Yeah. Shout out to Douglas Trumbull. He was the effects supervisor on that film. Yeah, amazing innovator and artist.
Do you think we're in a distant future we're gonna have what Minority Report is all about, foretelling the future murders?
That I couldn't say. I think that gets the time prediction aspect is so, beyond the kind of technological innovation that the rest of the film shows. That part to me is like a whole other level that gets into a zone that I don't know enough about to know whether we've planted any seeds of that kind of technology now that are shaping up to be anything like that, the ability. And that's where the film takes their ability, the precog's ability to predict is not based on a computer algorithm. It's a genetic mutation, I believe, if I remember correctly. It's something very unique and biological. It's a quirk that the technology and the technologists find a way to tap into and translate their ability to see into a bunch of technological tools that humans can use. That's the interface and the gestural interface that Tom Cruise uses, of course, but to put these pieces together. But it all starts inside an organic flesh and blood being, a mutated human. And so that's where the film's technological crystal ball kind of takes a step to the side in a slightly different way. But when it comes to any other technology in there, including ethical decisions about privacy and about seeing you in the world when you don't know you're being seen, and your data being collected and being tracked everywhere you go, and then physical, tangible stuff like maglev transportation. Absolutely. That stuff, we're already seeing that. And gestural interfaces, gestural computing and immersive computing. All of that stuff is, in various ways, we're seeing it. So it's a firm yes to all of the tech besides the actual precog predictive stuff, which I just don't know much about.
I wonder, right? Like, we can talk about Philip K. Dick, who wrote Blade Runner and Minority Report. There was this, I think, where was I watching this? There was a Hollywood roundtable discussion with the likes of Ridley Scott, Quentin Tarantino, David O. Russell, and a few other directors. And there was this, I think it was there was a conversation. Do movies influence the future and technology, or is it just something that it just happens organically? For example, Star Trek: The Next Generation, like that's something that very vivid in my mind. Like whenever Doctor or Data or Geordi were going through this little tablet, right? Like checking the mechanics and the medical treatment, that's iPad, right? Like it's literally the exact same, almost the dimension and the concept of it. So just personally, do you feel that when we make these movies or these stories, do they actually become the reason the technology becomes, or is it just something that's going to happen anyways?
Both. The answer is both. But do I believe that it is an influence? not the only influence, but an influence? Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And that, zooming out of even just sort of aside from movie making, like we're talking about, I believe storytelling and technology and the art and creative side of our what we make is an influence to the technological engineering and technological innovation. And I believe ideally they speak to each other. There's a conversation and an influence constantly going back and forth. Technology influences the arts, and the arts influence technology because technology and culture can't be separated completely ever. They are part and parcel. The conversation and the tension and the sort of gravitational pull between these things, you can't avoid it. They're part of the same continuum. That the way technology innovates and invents things is in response to a need, whatever that need is, a product need, a marketing need, a profit need, or a genuine cultural or sociological practical need. Any number of combinations of those things. And on the creative side, you have a lens on our real world from storytellers whose job it is essentially to interpret that and to tell stories about the impact of technologies like this on our culture. And we use sci-fi as one of the main mediums to do that in, which is why I love it so much.
Yeah.
Sci-fi for me is not just an escape; it's an escapist kind of genre, but it's about, more importantly, it's a reflection. It's a lens on our current life, and it's a stage on which to practice, rehearse our certain scenarios. And see where they might go if this was developed, or if that was developed, or if this got into the wrong hands, or whatever it is, both for better or worse. So yeah, absolutely, the arts, including movies, have such a deep cultural impact that can't help but be an influencer on which technologies are developed, not a sole decision maker, but at least which technologies enter the popular awareness and the popular kind of conversation.
Yeah.
For sure.
I see that happening. I mean, when Ready Player One came out, what was like 5 years ago? I mean,
Yeah.
it's already happening. Like metaverse is already here. But one of the things that I was really fascinated by, and I'm kind of going off topic, you've probably seen AI, Spielberg and Kubrick's film, right? Yeah. The whole concept of futuristic society where robots are discriminated, when they're mistreated, I genuinely believe that's around the corner. Like we're very, like, I think the next 20, 25 years is
Yeah.
probably going to be a place for that. But my point to that is that Spielberg has this nag with all of his films, just figuring out what the future could be in a very discreet way. Obviously he has a team of people that helps him and everything, but his timing with projects and foretelling
Yeah.
what the future would hold. I mean, yeah, Minority Report and AI were like materials of Kubrick and Philip K. Dick, but the timing of the way they were made, I mean,
Yeah.
Minority Report is already here, except
Yeah. In so many ways. Yeah. No, I think these are sometimes, they're kind of a testing ground. Some of the things we see in these films are coming true, as you say, before our eyes. The seeds were planted for a lot of that technology. Again, that's kudos to Spielberg for grounding the film's production design, and Alex McDowell and all of the people who put that together and synthesized all that research into this fiction. They grounded it in research. And, the gestural interface, that was based on technology that was being done for real at the time. I wish I could remember the name of the fellow who was spearheading some of that. But it's easy to find out that he's very well known for it, for the gestural stuff.
Mhm.
I worked at Microsoft after my film career on the HoloLens, which is a mixed reality, augmented reality headset,
Sure.
which mixes digital content with the real world you see. You heard of AR glasses. Well, this was an early version about 10 years ago in that. So the HoloLens was a successful experimental product launch to prove this tech. And it was very interesting to me to get to work with some of the stuff that I had worked on fictitious movies about in earlier parts of my career. Here, this was like science fiction stuff coming to life. And that included gestural interfaces, using pinch gestures and other sort of specific language of how you use your hands and your fingers instead of a mouse, right?
Yeah.
Instead of clicking a mouse on a screen. We were there to sort of help invent and develop what the alternative to that is in a immersive space when you don't have a screen, no mouse, no cursor. What's your version of that in immersive 3D space? So that was a wonderful opportunity I happened to have later to again take some of these sci-fi ideas of the future, and here it is happening for real in a very close way. And so now gestural interface in immersive VR and AR is now a whole area of user experience and user interface design. Spatial computing is now a thing those are words we use. Spatial computing, what does that mean? It means immersive computing that's not on a screen. I mean, that's pretty mind-blowing. And when I look back at Tom Cruise gesturally controlling this interface of the crime sort of puzzle assembling the fragments of memory on this glass curved thing, it's so wonderful to see that connection. I like the fact that there was almost a nostalgic tactile quality to the fact that was mapped onto a surface of glass, that there was a tangible quality. He's not wearing immersive glasses.
Yeah.
He is still, there's something on which there's a screen. There's a screen there, even though it's a very shiny, cool screen. There was an old-fashioned quality to some of the technology. And the wooden ball that gets carved, that comes through that sort of crazy contraption. That machine has a very sort of old world quality, earlier 20th century quality. And I connect that in my mind to some of Blade Runner's aesthetic, this sort of retro future design of machinery that has this wonderful combination of sort of early and mid 20th century mechanical quality with whatever mysterious digital future tech is inside. It's just really cool.
No, and I think that's what connects with the audience, right? And I mean, you worked on Minority Report, which is like a futuristic tale, and then going back a few years in your career, you went back to Normandy and Saving Private Ryan, and you worked on that. You know, that again, two different movies completely. You know, one that had already happened, and the one that's kind of already happened in the future. So, how did you get involved in Saving Private Ryan, and what was your role on that? If you can just sort of dive into that for us, please.
Oh, happily. Yeah, that is going back in time for sure, several years. So that came out in 98, I think. 99. So I have some artwork here I'll show you in a minute, which is dated 97. So that shows you how early we were sort of visualizing some of the effects. So that was I joined ILM in 96. So this was one of the first films I worked on. I worked on the Star Wars special editions when I first got there in a sort of support capacity. It was the first project they threw me into. And I worked on a couple of other smaller projects. We also, I should add, had a commercials division at ILM then. So we would, in the art department, an concept artist and an art director like me would get thrown into whatever project came in. And in between movie projects, there was always some cool commercial that would need some visual effects, characters or animation or something designed. So I would work on that. So this came as one of the first big features that I got. So I believe, and this was talk about scale of effect shots. You know, ILM has a number of shots in the movie, but they're really invisible. You don't know they're there, with a couple of exceptions. They don't ever say, look at me, I'm an effect shot. And it's a relatively small number compared to anything now. It's again, not about the visual effects, but the visual effects come in to help the story when they're needed. And it was another great example of Spielberg not overusing the tools and technology, especially for Saving Private Ryan. He wanted to exercise that same storytelling discipline. I was going to say sobriety, but discipline is a better word, because it can be extravagant and it can be immersive and it can be extreme. Obviously, it's sober suggests that it's tamped down, but it's not a question of sort of volume. The intensity can be at a very high volume, but how he's doing it is where the discipline comes in. So discipline's a great word. As visual effects art director, this all translates to this very different kind of challenge creatively. And I also needed to immerse myself in the history. So for me, as an art director, one of the first things I do with any project is research. I immerse myself. Obviously, I read the script or the treatment or whatever I have. I look at any reference material the studio sends us or any visual concept work they have done, look at all of that. And then I go do my own research. And by any means necessary, I just learn about this thing. When the mummy, it was ancient Egypt and ancient Egyptian architecture. I had to learn a lot about that so I could basically bastardize it and turn it into this epic, Hollywood thing, a version of it. But I still did a lot of research. In this case, I researched Normandy and that moment in World War II. And I spoke to veterans. I cold called veterans associations across the country and would just kind of be referred from one to another in an attempt to find out some very specific information about this or that to make sure that anything that we introduced into the film as a visual effects element was authentic and historically accurate. And that was in keeping with the respect, obviously, that Spielberg and all of us really felt responsibility to tell the story respectfully and accurately. So again, there weren't very many effect shots that I directly impacted, except one very big one, which was this Normandy beach landing scene, which happens after the initial invasion sequence that the film is so known for. So this is the aftermath, the follow-up, once the Allied forces have established their presence on the beach and they've kind of set up camp. This is the moment there. And it's at the end of a very, very long dolly shot. That's a dolly and crane shot. I mean, it's this elaborate, it goes forever, following a conversation between two characters in the foreground as they walk through this entire camp. And then finally, the camera at the end tracks up to this. So when we would watch this shot in dailies, we would watch the entire shot every time to finally get to this moment. We watched that shot go back and forth many, many times. So this is the plate. This is what was real.
Oh, wow.
And they had a handful of, a dozen or two soldiers, costume soldiers marching with a couple of vehicles, a tank or two and an armored truck or two that would drive along here and march. And they basically, I was not on set, by the way. This was a beach in Ireland, doubling for Omaha Beach.
Yep.
And they put all of these I don't remember what they're called, these basically barrier pieces, these spiky pieces to deter any enemy boats coming in.
Sure.
And that was real. The weather and the puddles and all that were real. And basically this classic crowd duplication technique, nothing too revolutionary. They filmed a bunch of troops and the trucks here, then they filmed another pass of them here, switched up a bit, and they filmed several of those going down the beach. And they combined them later in the compositing stage. And so this illustration basically shows what all of the elements would be. And this is what becomes a kind of a visual document of the design that the director, the production, and ILM and all of us use to agree together. It's like a visual design. It's like a contract. Okay, this is what we're all approving. Spielberg approves this. He likes the composition. We're going to do that. And we're going to follow that as closely as possible. So that's the purpose of this piece of artwork, which is done in Photoshop, basically painted over this plate.
Really? That was in Photoshop?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. All digital tools. So again, I'm not much of a 3D artist. I'm a 2D. Photoshop is a 2D tool.
Yeah.
So I painted all these things, but then this goes to our amazing computer graphics team that use a combination of matte painting, digital matte painting techniques, and to create these ships, and 3D animation as well for some of these barrage balloons, as I learned they are called. So I had some, veterans and and refer some books and historical books and things, and they would tell me what these things were. And these balloons were actually something I decided to add in, inspired by photographs I saw. And I said, what are those blimps? How big are they? Are they small? Are they large? What are they used for? Why are they there? And so that's one of the tracks of research I did. And I learned what they're for. They're not huge. They're about 10 to 15 feet long, and they are suspended there to keep enemy fighters from flying down across the beach, strafing, doing a strafing run. They'll tangle any plane like that up and bring them down. And they provide a distraction, a challenge that will make that plane easier to shoot down if it does try an attack. So I did not know that before, and I thought it would make a nice compositional element in the shot. And this is a way that I could ask Spielberg, what do you think? And he could make some changes. He could ask for, maybe put some more or put some less, or I don't like them, take them out. Whatever the answer might be, this is where that conversation happened.
Yeah. I think in the final shot, I'm just looking at it right now. They had like one in the foreground and then many of them in the distant background.
They stuck really close. Our team stuck really close to this because, again, it was like one iconic shot. Spielberg had approved this. So the directive was stay pretty close to it. But it's still then, this is just a piece of art. It's a still image. Whatever the composition is has to ultimately move. And I think that foreground blimp you're talking about actually kind of parallax shifts in frame because the camera is moving. So that was one of the ideas. The whole purposes of putting those in was to have some parallax. If you're moving down a space and you have a row of telephone poles or trees, you see the depth. And so I wanted to put something in the frame that showed the depth in the space. So it was a wonderful thing to have that included. A lot of the other work that ILM did, which was brilliant work at the time, was, I would call it sort of gore and explosion augmentation. We augmented and made a lot of the immediate danger stuff worse. We did cleanup. We added some really brutal injuries and bullet wounds and bloody stuff and a lot of other incidental things. Explosive damage to walls and things like that, simulating gun fire, impact hits, and things like that. Basically, adding stuff in that would have been too dangerous on set to have an explosion, for instance, go off right next to an actor. And so a lot of the ways we used effects in that sequence tied so closely, of course, to the way Spielberg and his partner in crime, Janusz Kaminski, the DP, for that sequence, how they crafted it was very challenging. And everything we added, again, needed to look completely realistic and blend in with that handheld aesthetic.
Well, it's also the shutter speed that Janusz Kaminski changed, right? Just to give it a little bit more dramatic.
Absolutely. And the bleach bypass processing as well, in terms of that bluish teal kind of wash that the whole thing has, emulating film stock of the day, that gave it this nostalgic quality. That same cool look and the heavy grain, that bleach bypass look, of course, was used in Minority Report as well.
Yes.
So
we
would do all our stuff for Minority Report like this shot, full color, normal color, if you will. We would design it and texture all the things and render them all as if they were, more realistic modern cinematography, and then we would treat those color-wise in the compositing stage to match that look.
Yeah,
I took a lot of the color out and added a lot of grain back in. So.
Yeah, Saving Private Ryan's opening sequence. I mean, I still remember watching in the movie theater, and the one thing that there's two things that no matter how many times I watch it, I always appreciate it, and that doesn't mean that the rest is not to be appreciated of, is when the soldiers fall off the boat, and then there's this one guy pulling the soldier out, and the camera goes in the water and out the water, in the water, and then the bullets passing by and the sound effects of those. They were so real. And talking about your effects, the multiplication of soldiers on the beach and the digital thing. I don't know if you ever saw. This came out probably 3-4 years after Saving Private Ryan. A bunch of young guys recreated the Omaha Beach sequence.
I don't
You should
remember seeing that. No.
you should watch it on. It's on YouTube. Well, all they did was it was just two guys,
Mm.
and they used green screen techniques, and climbing on the mountain, and they put together like a mammoth beach invasion scene. Let me just see if I can find it right now.
Wow.
It's incredible, and it just goes to show the technology, how it's become so accessible. Even at that time.
Well, even then, exactly. That's what's impressive. I wouldn't be as surprised to hear you tell me about a couple of young filmmakers who tried to do that now, or even in the last 5 years, because everything's become so much more accessible. But
Yeah.
back then, even 4 years after the movie, that's still early 2000s. That's all the more impressive. So that's great.
Yeah, no, I'll send you the link. They just did a crazy job. I mean, it's like a 4-minute long video,
Oh, I
and
definitely want to watch that
and
for
it's
sure.
looks
Yeah, send me the
incredible.
link.
Yeah.
Send over the link. Yeah.
Let me do that right now before I forget.
Okay.
Um,
By the way, do you want me to, in the interest of time, I have more Minority Report, a couple of more
yes,
things to show. Would you like me to
yes,
go back and show those, and you can
yeah.
decide whether to cut them in?
I think
What do you want to do?
I think let's do that. I think BFG is something that we'll probably hold off if that's okay with you.
I don't
I
have any of the sketches.
Okay,
That's
that's
absolutely
great.
fine. We
Then
don't need
let's
to.
just
We don't need to.
focus on Minority Report for the next little bit, and I think that should be good.
Awesome.
So, what other stuff did you work on Minority Report?
Well, we were talking about the Maglev architecture, and there's one other shot that I'll show you something from, because it's an interesting example again of the collaboration between the physical sets and their design, and how those can influence the design of the visual effects outside world. So this was also a shot that I got to design myself based on just a really rough script description, because it had not been designed yet by the studio. So this was
Sure.
one of those kind of surprises that came a little later as an insert that Spielberg wanted to help connect the story. And it was a really awesome just opportunity that fell into my lap. So I jumped at the opportunity to actually design a piece of this world inspired by everything else. So basically it's this shot, which takes us from, and this is my very first sketch, but it basically takes us from Anderton's apartment. It's the commute shot, basically. It takes
Yes.
him from his apartment out down this Maglev freeway towards Washington, D.C. in the distance. And it simply is a transition shot that takes us from one moment and
To-
brings us into the next beat of the story, and gets to show off us a bit of the world. So this was again putting to the test all of the balances that the balancing act I had to do, which was kind of fantastical sci-fi, freeway on-ramp structures, and this giant thing without it looking silly or unrealistic. How do you make that happen? And it was quite challenging balance to be struck. So this building being round, this is where Anderton's apartment is. So Alex McDowell and his team had designed the interior, very, very cool interior of his apartment. And I don't have a shot right here. I'll send you one later, but I don't have something to show right now here of the interior. But basically it included a carport. Basically his Maglev car can, if you remember, just park itself right in this little alcove, and he gets right out into his apartment. And so everyone has, it's like their own garage. And so we only saw that from the inside. This is a cool shot I managed to find of the set seen from the outside. So we're looking at the outside of this giant set of the apartment, which you can see just barely poking through. And this is how it looks on the outside with the full-size mock-up of the car. And you can see these rails here, because in the shot, we see it comes up those rails and sort of curves into place and settles in. And so that is sort of the cue that I had. That's all I had to go on. What would the outside of this building even look like? And so that was fun to extrapolate. So I basically worked with 3D tools, and this is a concept painting again from Aaron McBride, and this basically is what a final piece of concept art it looks like for the CG team to go and actually build this out. And these are all texture references here of rusted metal and stained concrete and sort of cast concrete struts and supports, how weathering and dirt and grime gather in the gaps, all of those things that are needed to make this look like something grounded and real and not necessarily pretty. But specifically the architectural challenge, you can see up here, these little ports I designed as sort of units. These are each apartment units. And then the idea is that you come off of this, your own personal little port, and there's the curvature. You kind of come down, go around to the nearest place where you can join up with this exit ramp off the building. And the nice thing about movie making is we don't have to worry about how all that works. That's on the other side of the building. The idea was to keep this super, super simple. We wanted to follow his car when it comes off of his balcony, his little carport, down onto this road and off
to the next one.
And to the next one. So this is an example of the 3D previs. So I again, I don't do a lot of 3D, but I, in this case, mocked this up in 3D, and you can see that sequence here. Very, very simple. Goes from his apartment, then the car comes this way, merges on and goes down. We follow it down and around, and we join the rest. And we see, you know, all of this needs to be choreographed. What do these cars do? Some of them are going here. Some of them are on the inside. Some of them go here. So these are sort of the logistics, the details that somebody has to worry about that nobody in the audience is going to really notice. And here is an almost finished frame using a matte painting with the Washington Monument in the background. You can see this is not fully finished because we don't have all the traffic on it, but it gives you at least an idea, closer idea. So you can see how closely that ended up resembling the final shot, which is again really fun. You know, we had the budget and we had time constraints, and so for background skyscrapers and buildings, we had to come up with a modular system of easily, quickly building these. So here are a bunch of renderings for how we could mix and match some simple cylindrical shapes and different textures and window configurations, and quickly get a bunch of background buildings that we needed for that canyon of skyscrapers that we see going by in the background while Anderton is jumping from car to car again.
Yeah.
We had to show, I mean, I always compare it to classic 2D animation like the Flintstones, Hanna-Barbera animation, where someone's running in the foreground and you've got the background going by, right? This is essentially the same thing. We're just showing stuff in the background that you're not meant to focus on, but it needs to show how far down we're traveling during that sequence again. So it's a fun illustration of how many of these details someone has to design, think about, build, light, and blend in and composite to the whole to make everything come seamlessly together. And a lot of the stuff is sort of incidental, you know. Here's something else that I did early on in the show that was very incidental. No one's going to ever notice this. But if you remember in the Hall of Containment, where Anderton gets his tour and has his conversations with this character, Gideon, and the Gideon's ramp. So they built this part right here, circled in red as a set. And then they built this part as a set. But this part here, we see only as a digital, this is a digital piece, the extending arm. So it's a completely throwaway incidental piece of the architecture of this place, but it's a detail that mattered to Spielberg. And he wanted us to see how this place worked, how this thing extended from here out to here, so they can then have the rest of this very cool sequence kind of spinning through all of these containment capsules containing you know, presumed criminals. So, you know, this is a design that gets built by our CG team. It's integrated into the shot and nobody knows about it ever again. I have to tell one story that everyone seems to think is very funny, and it is a good story. And it's another funny example of how physical stuff comes into the artistic design process. So you might remember another incidental shot. Sorry for the shiny print.
Yeah.
Lycon was the name of this character, the drug addict in the street who Anderton goes to buy drugs from. And he's got no eyes. And he has this big quote that he says as he takes his glasses off. So big shock shot right here. So Spielberg wanted a very specific amount of gross out shock value, but not too much for what was inside there, the scars. So this is an early painted version that I tried painting over the frame. And none of these ideas were really quite clicking. Close, but no cigar. So he would send them back, doesn't look real enough. It's too gross or not gross enough, or I want to see something more specific. And so I thought, well, one of the ways to kind of up the grossness and give it something concrete is some stitches. If we actually see some scarification and stitches, but that was beyond my painting ability to do that realistically. So I decided to sculpt an eye socket and sculpt it myself. And then I went and got my wife's sewing kit, my favorite part of the story, her favorite part of the story also. I borrowed her sewing kit and stitched with a needle and thread into this sculpey eye socket and then photographed it. And I kind of got the look that I needed. And then I photoshopped that back into this for the concept to get his approval. And he said, thumbs up. In our dailies video transmission, I told him the story of I left out one of the most important parts. My wife's objection was not to me borrowing her sewing kit. It's to the fact that I sewed chicken skin onto the socket of clay. We had a leftover chicken in the refrigerator. Seriously, this is true. And I peeled the skin off and I sewed it. You can see there, that's chicken skin right in there, sewn. And that was the extra ingredient of realism that made it really gross. And when I told Spielberg the story about that, he got a chuckle out of that and said to thank my wife. So she's not credited in the movie, unfortunately, but maybe she should be. The story lives on. So realism, sometimes you just got to look at reality in order to get the best result. And in that case, I had to build it myself. And so chicken skin on.
The tangible stuff, right? Like nobody notices these things and they just look real in the grand scheme of things and they look effective. How does it, or does it not, or does it ruin your experience as a moviegoer watching these movies that you work on, especially like Minority Report and Saving Private Ryan?
It's funny, if I were still in the industry, the answer might be different, but as I've kind of been away from it for a while, I've gone back to being more in the audience. That doesn't mean I can look at any effects shot and not think of it as an effects shot. And I, of course, have to, I've always got that lens on, of assessing it. But as an audience member now, I'm also able to be affected by these movies, even though I know how fake they are and I know they're not real, but I can get swept up in them again, which I kind of like. And it means that I can kind of enjoy being entertained by them a bit more. I can have both those lenses going at the same time, and I kind of switch back and forth. And when I see a movie and watch it with my wife, I still can't help it. I'll still say, "Oh, that's an effect shot" sometimes, and she'll say, "Yeah, don't ruin it for me." And so I'm being quiet more often now and just letting it go by. Frankly, part of it is because there are so many effect shots now. There's so much visual effects everywhere that I would be talking nonstop if I was pointing out every effect shot that I saw. It's so everywhere now that it doesn't even bear mentioning because it's a cool effect. It bears mentioning if it's a beautiful shot or particularly just unusual or just beautiful and effective. Then I'll comment. But she's appreciating that part as much as me, my wife, that is. You don't have to be an effects nerd to appreciate that part of it. So I think my lens has shifted a bit. I can still enjoy movies.
But I think also audiences have become more knowledgeable when to pick effects. Like, for example, if I'm watching something and the effects are not done well, Like
Yeah.
an average audience member is going to pick it up. Oh, is that green screen? That would be the first question like they would
Oh yeah.
ask.
Or does it
Um,
look CG? Does it just look digital? Does
yeah,
a character, digital Spider-Man, move properly? Or
you
does he
can
look
tell.
like he's light? You can totally tell.
You can tell.
Yeah.
You can tell. But
So I agree that our audience has become much more sophisticated in their visual sort of quality bar, and the standard. The bar
but
is both higher in some ways, and the bar is lower in other ways, because there's so much of it. And any MCU movie, any Marvel Cinematic Universe movie is just filled with so many. It almost just becomes noise, and it's just kind of becomes it's a different medium. To me, it's not as special at all as far as visual effects.
I refuse to see MCU movies, or I have no interest in them. But I think going back to what audience really cannot tell, well, I shouldn't say cannot tell. What audience really appreciate more than anything is the depth of characters and storytelling,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, the TV series. I
Yeah.
mean, marvelous stuff. And even in a film like, Minority Report, Saving Private Ryan, AI, yeah, they're about futuristic and past, but it's the characters and the story that the audience, when you get connected to the characters and the story,
Of course.
everything becomes
Absolutely.
real. Everything becomes
Absolutely.
real.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That
Absolutely right.
yeah.
Effects can never be the thing. Well, I mean, they can be, but it's a different kind of movie. It's
You
a
know
lot
what I
more of
mean?
a,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Of course. But
Yeah.
the effects are much more effective if they're part of a compelling story. And in
Story.
order to have a compelling story, you need to have compelling characters we care about, period. And without them, it's just a showcase for effects artistry. And we might as well just look at some concept art or paintings, or just watch a reel full of effect shots, which is fine, but it's just,
Yeah.
as far as it goes, you want to see, it has to be a part of a story. I'll also say that even just talking about like environmental effects and sort of non-character focused effects, elegant design is also something I think good design of a shot, classic
Yeah,
sort of discipline of just visual composition,
absolutely.
basic. The basic level of artistry is what matters to me, and to a lot of audiences, I think, even if they're not thinking about it. And when you're talking about an environment, I for some reason I got coming to my head another one of my favorite relatively recent sci-fi films, Arrival. So
Mm,
Denis Villeneuve, obviously, and his beautiful sense of composition that you see in all of his films, and you see again, of course, in the new Blade Runner and in Dune, that composition that is so beautifully informed, the composition of the shots and the way those that ship hovers over the valley
yeah.
in Arrival.
Mhm.
It's not about being flashy. It's not about being complex or Baroque. It's a minimalist design, but it's so elegant and so dramatic. And the audience probably knows that it's not. Of course, they know it's not real. It's all willful suspension of disbelief, but you appreciate the design of that, the grandeur, and what it says about the aliens, what it says about the technology and who they are, that they've designed this minimalist curving ship that's so unlike so many other sci-fi ships we see.
Yeah,
So I think that is another aspect of the design that audiences will appreciate when it's done well. And that's
absolutely.
this minimalism again, this less is more aesthetic that relies on classic composition and artistic art, composition rules and how to compose a frame and shapes, all of that
Yeah.
basic stuff.
And I also think that, people like Tarantino, Spielberg, Nolan, Scorsese, even Coppola, like, going back to the 70s. One thing that I really get immersed, and I'm sure you do too, and a lot of people do, but they don't probably realize, is that when there is when you are with a character in an environment and there is no cut, to the over the shoulder cut shots or excessive cut,
Mm-hmm.
you get immersed into it so much.
Yeah.
Like, I'll give you an example. I don't know if you've seen the Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep and Spielberg movie, The Post.
Yeah.
Uh,
Years ago. Yeah. When
yeah.
it first came out. Yeah.
So you probably didn't notice this. I mean, I didn't notice it until I saw Spielberg's interview, but it was the opening shot of them in the restaurant. Spielberg had filmed so much coverage, right? Like over the shoulder and all that stuff. But he also had a master. And that 8, or maybe I don't know the time, but definitely over 5 minutes, was all one shot with
Mm,
both of them in the frame in the restaurant, people moving in the back. And it just immerses you so much into your characters and your
yeah,
story. And sometimes the best editing is no editing as well. Like
yeah.
going back,
No, I agree. We've had there's a whole subgenre now of oneers, as they call them, a oneer.
yeah,
That's the slang. One shot, one take, even if it's not fully real, it's now this stylistic trope, unfortunately. So, but we've had it really well used, and used to really good
yeah.
effect to
Not
immerse
as a
you, and
gimmick
then
though,
sometimes
right?
it's a gimmick, right? It can
Yeah,
also be a
yeah,
gimmick, but
yeah.
I'm a huge Alfonso Cuarón fan, and he's someone who loves to use that technique. So, I love his use of it in Birdman. I love his use of it in Gravity.
And
I
Gravity.
enjoy it in the way he uses it in Children of Men, particularly. My gosh, that was when he first started bringing his version of that one take long
Yeah,
shot, to bear in a really effective way. That to me, that was before it had become abused, as a
yeah,
gimmick.
yeah. No,
But
definitely. I'm not saying that's something to do all the time, but it has to serve the story. Like if
that's right.
what the scene entails, right? If you're just
That's
doing
right.
it for the hell of it, then it's just like overusing the effects. There's no
That's
difference.
right. That opening shot in Birdman to me was a beautiful demonstration of that chaos, of that moment, and all of the different parts of that theater, and all of the introducing us to all of these characters and all of these moments with this sense of real-time urgency, that really, really worked well. Later in the film, I didn't feel it needed it as much, and I believe he goes to
Yeah,
a more traditional editorial style in other parts of the movie, if I recall. I need to watch it again. But I don't think he keeps that up through the whole movie for its own sake. It's mostly that opening part where it serves a purpose.
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. Well, listen, Alex, thank you so much for giving me your valuable time and talking to me about Minority Report and your work on that, and as well as Saving Private Ryan. Anything else you
Absolutely.
want to add?
No, it's just been a pleasure to talk with you today, and really fun to go back in time and sort of remember these experiences and share some of the stories and artwork. It's a lot of fun, and it's really nice that you're still interested in hearing about this stuff. It's great, and I'm honored to be a part of these conversations that you're having and collecting, in honor of DreamWorks history. It's again an honor. I'm happy to do it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment, and do come back for another episode. Until then, have a great day.